So today I will talk about lots of validation, how we can properly validate our algorithms. And so when we think of machine learning, we often see ourselves somewhere in the setting, thinking about our new architectures, our new neural networks to solve interesting problems. But sometimes we forgot a little bit that there's much more about machine learning. So it's not only about creating new models, it's also about how we design our data sets, how we annotate the data, how do we do the validation with metrics, rankings, etc. So there are many things that are as important actually as the models. And I will tell you a bit about different things, not all of them, because this is just such a huge topic. But before I go into details, let me start with an example of why validation is actually important. And perhaps you know this example. So it was about a rocket called Ariane 5. And in 1996, there was the very first flight. And as you see in this video over here, after a few seconds, this rocket suddenly flipped 90 degrees in the wrong direction and exploded. This is, of course, very unfortunate, but what happened here? The problem was that the engineers used a new hardware for this rocket, but the old software of an older version of a rocket. And this combination was not properly validated and tested. So the problem was that they now wanted to store a 64-bit floating point value into a 16-bit integer variable. And as you may imagine, just didn't work. So the maximum value of this integer was just quickly exceeded, turned negative, and then, this rocket exploded. And this is just one example of why we should always make sure to properly validate everything that we do. And here you see a few examples from different people emphasizing that it's actually very crucial to validate and evaluate our algorithms, or basically everything what we're doing. And also people from DeepMind or OpenAI saying that this is a very overlooked skill. So now that we talked about that it is crucial, I will talk about different things, how we could validate, what are problems. But before we go into this, how can we actually find the best algorithm for a problem? So if you look at different articles, you will basically see every author will claim that their method is the new state of the art, outperforming all the others. But can we compare them? Not really, because all of them are validated on their own specific data sets, use their own metrics and whatever. So it's really tricky to find the best fitting algorithm for a very specific research question. When we have a look at how this is done for a new medication, for example, or new treatment, then people usually perform clinical trials. And we have an equivalent for this for AI algorithms, which are image analysis competitions. And perhaps you know them, perhaps you have even participated in such a challenge, but I wanted to quickly explain what this is all about. So in such a competitions, people who develop algorithms compete against each other under the very specific same conditions. So using the same data sets, same performance measures, submission methods, all these things are really done for a fair comparison of these algorithms. They're typically organized at conferences, but perhaps you know Kaggle, where you also find many different challenges for different problems. And if you win such a challenge, you typically are somehow famous in the field. Often also you get high prize monies, which is of course a nice incentive to participate in the challenge. You're the new state-of-the-art methods, you're somehow famous. So it also is important for careers, for example. So if you win a challenge, you typically have your PhD done and everything is fine. So these challenges are really a great tool and very important. And also they have led to common data sets that can be used for validation, which is of course very important. We always search for new data sets. You will find a challenge for everything that you may imagine. So different fields of applications, modalities. So it's really an important tool. And before I go into detail, I just wanted to mention, I will talk a lot about challenges today. But if we think of how we're actually doing algorithm benchmarking in papers, it's basically the same thing. So when you look at different papers, all of them will compare their new method to state-of-the-art method to other methods in the field. So they're basically conducting a mini challenge because they have a fair comparison, hopefully at least. They create rankings and compare themselves against others. So everything that I'm talking about also is for the very specific algorithm benchmarking of your own specific method. So going back to the importance of challenges or fair comparisons, we wanted to know whether the winner of such a challenge is really the best algorithm, because this is what it's all about, and we would assume that the quality is very high of these challenges. So we had a look at different aspects of challenges and validation in general, and I wanted to start with the first one, which is probably the most intuitive one, reporting. Perhaps not seeing that important, but as you see in this quote over here, it's the one practice that can universally commanded as transparent and complete reporting of all facets of a study, so that we can interpret everything, that we can understand the study and everything that's what's been done. So we thought about what are the parameters that should be reported for a challenge. And there were some that are somehow obvious, so things like how large is my data set, which metrics were used, but also some that may not be so obvious in the first place. So, for example, as a challenge participant, am I allowed to also use external data, for example? Or how are missing values handled in the rankings? Who annotated the data? How many annotators? All of those things are important to understand and be able to interpret a challenge. So we analyzed more than 500 competitions, and the results were not so promising because we found that only a median of 64% of parameters were reported. And only 6% of these parameters were reported by all challenges, and these were somehow the obvious parameters like the title of the challenge. To give you some more concrete examples, 85% of challenges, so a very large proportion, didn't give instructions on whether the training data that were given by the organizers of a challenge could have been complemented by private or public data. And if we now recall that challenges have the purpose of a fair comparison, this is definitely not fair. If you, for example, have access to thousands more images and other teams just don't. Another example is that in 66% of tasks, there was no description on how the reference, so the gold standard annotation, was performed. And this is, of course, very critical. On the one hand, these data sets are often made publicly available. And on the other hand, our algorithms should learn something meaningful. And if the data quality is low, then also our algorithms will not perform very good. So how could we solve this? We had a look at how this is done in other communities, and we saw that for clinical trials, for example, you often have reporting guidelines. And we did the same. So first we founded the Initiative on Biomedical Image Analysis Challenges, short BIAS, with the goal of bringing challenges to the next level of quality. And then we worked on this reporting guideline. And this guideline is basically a checklist with parameters that should be reported, on the one hand for designing a challenge and on the other hand for reporting the results. And you basically have all the parameters inside, and speaking both of the perspective of a reviewer of a challenge and also of writing a challenge as an author, it definitely helps to make sure that you have all the information available. So this is also used for the Medical Image Analysis Journal, and we registered this with the Equator Network, which you see on the right here. Perhaps you don't know it, but it's quite useful. You will find reporting guidelines for different aspects, for challenges, for example, but also generally for reporting AI. So this is really helpful, and I think it was a great step forward. So this was also implemented in form of a structured challenge submission system for conferences. So we now had a challenge review process where we had direct quality control over challenge proposals that were submitted for a conference. So in case that a challenge then was accepted, it was executed, but the problem was we didn't have quality control over what people were doing afterwards. So if you publish a paper, it's basically out there. You cannot change anything. But for a challenge, we couldn't control if organizers, for example, used a completely different ranking method or whatever. So we also wanted to overcome this, looked at what other people were doing, and also used this for our research. And we call this challenge registration. So we uploaded the design document with all of the different parameters online so that we somehow had an indirect quality control. So somehow peer pressuring people to stick with their proposals because all of the information was publicly available, and people would automatically start complaining if the information differs. You would have this list of different challenges with a DOI link to the design document, looking something like this. And also we integrated versioning control. So if there is something that changed, for example, So if you organize a challenge, it typically takes a lot of time, so 1 or 2 years. And sometimes, for example, the data set changes. Then this was reported back to the organizers of the conference. They reviewed it again, and then we have this versioning control with all changes highlighted in the design proposals. So I think with reporting, we were somehow fine. So we looked at different aspects. And one important aspect for a competition are rankings, of course, because the rankings determine the best method, not only for challenges, but also if you do it in your research papers. But it's not so straightforward to computer rankings. There are actually many design choices that you can take. So we have different algorithms. Each of them produces one or multiple metric values for a bunch of images. How do we aggregate them? So some metrics do this on their own, but some don't. So do we aggregate per algorithm or per image? Do we use the mean, median, any other metric? So it's not so straightforward how we do this. However, we would think if we have an algorithm that is outperforming the others, that is winning a competition, this should be the best no matter how we compute the rankings. So we had a look at ranking robustness, and we got the data from all segmentation challenge from the MICAI conference. And we found that actually rankings are not so robust because they're sensitive to a range of different design parameters, how we actually compute these rankings. For example, which metric do we use? May sound obvious, but it really changes the results. How do we aggregate mean versus median or any other metric? Also the annotator. And here you see one example from a real challenge where we have 13 different algorithms and the ranking with the mean we see over here. We thought, okay, what happens if we exchange mean by median? Shouldn't be that much of a deal. This is what happens. So the ranking changes quite dramatically because now algorithm 1, the winner, is now at rank 5. So they basically exchange ranks. And if you're honest, if you look at the ranking with 13 algorithms, you typically mostly have a look at the first 3 algorithms. So it really changes the rankings. And we wanted to go a step further. We had a look at more than one ranking scheme. So this is a different challenge where we computed the default ranking scheme and 11 others. So things like exchanging, do we first aggregate per algorithm or per image? Do we use mean or median and different metrics? And here I highlighted 3 algorithms so that we could see if we're having some variations. And yes, we definitely do. So you see if we follow the winner, it's quite stable among the first 4 ranking scheme, but then it suddenly drops down to rank 11. And I think this is a really dramatic change. So it's somehow one of the really bad algorithms. Algorithm 6, somewhere in the middle, is now at the top, and also algorithm 11, which was very bad at the beginning, is now somewhat among the top algorithms. So definitely we need to do something about this. We need to somehow incorporate this. And we thought about how could we solve this. And the important thing that we noticed was visualization of results. So not only showing ranking tables, which is often done in publications. And here's one example. So we have 2 competitions, benchmarking experiments. Doesn't really matter. So we have 5 algorithms that we're comparing. And we're just plotting the metric values in forms of dots and box plots here. And in the top example, we see that the ranking is kind of obvious from these plots. So it's very clear. And at the bottom, well, it's not very clear. It's very random. Somehow we cannot really see which algorithm is better than the others. If we now compute a ranking, we see that both of them would yield the exact same ranking table. The problem about this is that we often in publications only have ranking tables. And with only this, we're not able to interpret the results. We don't know whether the winner is really superior to the others or are they very close. So already these simple visualization techniques are a very great step to interpret our results. But we didn't want to stop there. We went further and thought about more advanced methods to analyze the results, for example, incorporating statistical significance testing or ranking uncertainty. We're using bootstrapping, where we quietly change our data sets and see what happens to the ranks. And we also introduced visualization techniques for this. So here you see one example, which we call block plots. Here we see on the x-axis, again, the algorithms, and on the y-axis, potential ranks that could be achieved. And the radius of these blobs here indicate how often a specific rank is achieved during the bootstrap samples that we are calculating. And here we see the radius is all very large for all of these algorithms, so the ranking is absolutely clear. On the bottom, every algorithm will achieve every rank at some point, so this is definitely not a clear ranking. And here we could, for example, say we don't have one specific winner, but we have a group of 3, 4, 5 very similar algorithms, which is also a nice result. So if you're interested in using this for your own results, you could also do it, for example, if you're doing hyperparameter search to see which configuration works best. You could use it. So the link is at the bottom over here. You just insert a CSV file with metric values, and you get a full PDF report out with the different visualizations and also explanation of the different plots. I should mention here that it's currently written in R, so I'm not sure if you like it or if you rather used to Python. We're currently also working on putting this in a web toolkit, so making it accessible to everyone, just for note. Okay, so rankings are an important tool, and I already said one thing that influences rankings are metrics. And this is why we spend a lot of work into figuring out how we choose the best metrics, because it's not so obvious if we're now at the stage that we need to decide on the metric. Yeah, if you find yourself somewhere here seeing all of those different metrics, perhaps you don't know them, perhaps you just use what everyone else is doing, but every metric comes with very specific pros and cons. And how do we, how can we ensure that we use the right metric for our problem? So first we had a look at how this is done in practice currently. And here we looked at the registered challenges because there was one parameter, justification of metric selection. And what we often saw was something like you see over here. So it's a widely used metric, it's a standard metric, it's a commonly used metric. So often researchers are using metrics because they're common, because of their popularity and not really of their suitability for a specific problem. And this can be really an issue, and I wanted to show you a few examples of metric pitfalls here. So let's start with a quite simple example with a binary classification. We want to classify emails into spam versus no spam. Here you see our data set, and you see it's quite imbalanced. So we mostly only have spam emails and only 3 cases where we have no spam. However, we train an algorithm and we get an accuracy of 97%, which is of course a great score. However, we should think about what our algorithm is doing, because in this case, it will just always say that an email is spam, which makes it completely useless in practice. And the problem is that the accuracy metric, which is very common, is just not designed to handle class imbalance. And if we have used a different metric like the specificity, would have seen that there's definitely something going wrong with this metric. And this pitfall is very popular, so you probably also know about it. There are memes about it, so this is something that you may have already faced. But there are other pitfalls that may not be so obvious. For example, often the problem is not phrased correctly, or there's a problem metric mismatch. For example, what we often saw is that there was an object detection problem, but a segmentation metric to validate this. So let's suppose we have this example. We have a polyp detection, and we really want to make sure that all of these polyps are detected for patient safety. We want to remove them to make sure that the patient is getting healthy. So we have 2 algorithms that we could use. On the one hand, we have an algorithm that only predicts this large polyp over here and misses the 2 tiny ones. And we have an algorithm detecting all of them. So here for the large one, the bounding box is a bit too large, but it's not important. Here we are interested in detection. So this is the algorithm that we would prefer. However, as I said, often there's a segmentation metric used. And this metric counts pixel. And this metric will tell us that algorithm 1 is the superior one. And of course, in clinical practice, it would be really a disaster to use an algorithm like this and miss all of the small polyps. One last example, segmentation of small structures. Often occurs in practice. Here I have the examples of brain lesions, and you see they're very tiny, right? So here you see the reference segmentation. And if we look at the tiniest one, we would see that the segmentation matrix really differ if we only lose 1 or 2 pixels. So here, in this prediction, only 1 pixel is missing, and we already lose 9% in the score. If we're missing another pixel, so only 2 pixels missing, we already lost 20% of the score. And this is a very different behavior compared to large structures. So this is something that we should keep in mind. So I could talk about problems for the whole seminar, but I don't want to bother you with it. But if you're interested in it, we have a paper on it, which we call a picture story, because you have collected so many different limitations of metrics. And why we think that uncovering problems is good, raising awareness is good, it's always better to solve them. And this is why we founded what we call Metrics Reloaded, a large international consortium, going towards problem-aware recommendations of metrics. To explain you a bit the process, so basically 2.5 years of research went into this, and we had this consortium of more than 70 international experts on this topic, aiming for these problem-aware metric recommendations. So we started with a small group of coordinators. We worked on proposals of metric recommendation, metric candidates, and all of the different things that we have in the framework. And this was then put into a survey and given to our Delphi expert panel. And here we have integrated all of the different types of experts, so machine learning expert, statistics experts, prediction modeling experts, clinicians, biologists, so that we really have the different expertises. They had a look at the proposals of the recommendations, gave feedback, we analyzed the feedback, put it back into new surveys, new recommendations. They analyzed again, gave feedback. So with this iterative nature, we then came up with a consensus decision on the problem-aware metric recommendations. So generally, to give an overview of how this works, we're really starting from the problem. So here we call it biomedical problem, but it's basically also beyond biomedical. So generally, we start with a research question that we're interested in. We do what we call problem fingerprinting, which I will explain in a minute. So we're capturing all the relevant properties of our problem. This is why we call this fingerprint, so very specific to the research problem. And this is then captured, also in somehow kind of a checklist, which we then use for the metric recommendations so each of the different tasks that we are including has a pool of metric, and based on the fingerprint, we can then give very specific problem-aware recommendation with pros and cons of the different proposed metric candidates. And the problem fingerprint, so basically the most important part, has all of the different questions that are relevant when it comes to metric selection. For example, we ask for domain interest-related properties. So if I'm interested in the complete contour of the structure, or am I rather interested in only the center? Do I have very small structures or a high variability of structure sizes in my images? Do I have class imbalances? All those things matter when it comes to metric selection. And this is then very specific to your research problem. And the nice thing, given this problem fingerprint, it really generalizes across domains. So it's not important whether we have a CT image or something like natural images or satellite or whatever kind of image. It's just important that it's a classification task. And here we have 4 different tasks that we're looking at. So classification at image level. So really looking at the whole image, looking at objects, which would be object detection, pixels, which would be semantic segmentation, or a combination of object and pixel classification, which would then be instance segmentation. And all of these tasks are included in the framework, which you see here, and which, I know it looks quite complex, so you don't have to understand everything right now. I just wanted to go through different parts of it. So we start with the problem fingerprinting, we do the metric selection, and then we give some recommendations on how do we apply them, so how do we aggregate them and all those things. And you see with the 4 different colors, we have these different classification tasks, and we have different boxes. And each of this box with a plus symbol indicates a different family of metrics or type of metrics, for example, multi-class counting metrics. And for each of those boxes, we have candidates of metrics and a decision tree behind it. And the decision tree is based on the problem fingerprint. But I always know it looks very difficult. Let's start with an example. let's focus on semantic segmentation. And it directly looks much nicer. So we only have this yellow branch at the bottom. But to make it more concrete, let's have a very specific example. Let's say we want to have a segmentation of large objects. Two examples would be lung cancer segmentation from microscopy or liver segmentation from CT. So these are the steps that remain if we only focus on these tasks. Let's go through them in a bit more detail. So first, generate the correct problem category. So making sure that we're really facing a semantic segmentation problem. This is not always done correctly, so we also have a decision tree for this. Then we generate the problem fingerprint and go to the first type of metric, which are overlap-based metric. So metrics measuring the pixel overlap between the reference and our algorithm output. So we are looking at some inclusion and exclusion criteria. In our case, we need such a metric. And then we're going through the different questions of the fingerprint. So for example, are we exclusively interested in the center line of structures, which would not be the case in our large object segmentation case. But for example, if you're looking at airway trees or trees in general, or vessels or something like this, then it would be beneficial to only look at the center line, for example. Do we have an unequal severity of over-segmentation versus under-segmentation? So whether we're segmenting always a bit too much or too small amounts of the segmentation, which is not the case for our example. And then we're at this bottom node over here, which says select DICE or IAU based on a decision guide. And we introduced these decision guides because sometimes it's a bit not so straightforward to give recommendations which metric to use in the end. And here we were boiled down to 2 or maximum 3 of metrics, where we have really comparison pros and cons of these metrics so that the user can really see the trade-offs between using this or that metric and can decide for the very specific problem which is the best fitting metric. So in this case, the decision guide would basically say the metrics are really more or less the same. It's more a question of which community you're in. Medical uses more often DICE, so here we're selecting DICE. Then we're going back to the main process, selecting a boundary-based metric, so measuring how good is the contour of our prediction. Again, we're asked different questions of the fingerprint and selecting our metric. And finally, we have one more step, which we call select specific property or application-specific metric, because we just cannot include all possible metrics that exist out there. Lots of them are very specific, and this is why we included the step here. For example, clinicians are often only interested in the volume of a liver segmentation. They're not interested in technical measures, and this is why we here included also the absolute volume difference as a metric. And since we know that it's not so straightforward to follow all the steps, we instantiated the framework for common biomedical use cases that were requested by the community. So we asked, what are the use cases for which we would like to see recommendation? So in the paper, we include different types of scenarios. We include the fingerprint for them that we assumed based on literature research and by consulting experts. And here you see all the recommended metrics for those use cases. We also found that it's often quite difficult to acquire all the necessary information for a metric that exists. So it's often spread across different resources, different papers. So we wanted to collect all the information into one sheet, and this is why we call them metric cheat sheets. So for each metric, you find all the relevant information like the formula, description, also things like important relations to other metrics, relevant pitfalls and recommendations. We wanted to give a standard implementation of the metrics because we found that the implementation often differs quite a lot, and this makes a difference in the performance values. So we implemented them in the Monet framework, which you can also use for your research. And finally, we are currently working on a web toolkit for this framework. So this is currently not published yet, so you can go to this link if you're interested. Just write an email, we can give you the credentials. Where you find a better version, so not this design version over here. But basically the idea is you are just guided through the framework. So you get some explanations and it guides you through the different fingerprint questions, for example, small slice of structures. You're giving some explanations, and then you're guided through the different questions. Are you particularly interested in the center of structures? Do you have tubular structures? And then, you see that there are some the metric candidates popping up while you're guided through the different questions. So what else? There are some more things that I could tell you, but in the interest of time, I would just quickly mention them. So we wanted to go beyond rankings. Basically, the question that we had, how can we learn more from challenge results? And especially we were interested, what characterizes images that are hard to interpret? So what are the images that the algorithms fail on? So we conducted a statistical strength weakness analysis of algorithms based on metadata annotation. And here you see one example from our research. So we had a look at the data, and we had some annotation on image characteristics from which we thought, based on expert knowledge and literature research, what are the things that may impact our algorithm performance, for example. So in our case, it was a surgery example of medical instrument segmentation, where we thought, for example, if the medical instrument is covered by blood, this may cause some confusion for the algorithms, things like this. And based on our mixed model analysis, we could then find which are the factors that positively or negatively influence the results. So surprising also for us, there were some things like overexposed instruments or instruments covered by tissue, as you see examples on the bottom, that positively influenced the algorithm performance. But also we found the ones that are actually hard for the algorithms of the challenge, which you see at the bottom. So this is really quite helpful also if you want to tackle future algorithm development, to see, okay, these are the things that are currently not handled pretty good in a challenge. So I will work on an algorithm that is especially good in covering those. Also, at the beginning, we asked the question, is the winner really the best? We then wanted to go for, why is the winner the best? So we had a look at what is common practice in challenge participation, if current competition generate scientific progress, and which strategies characterize challenge winners. And here you see a figure from our publication where we then asked challenge winners what were the strategies. And the most commonly mentioned one was analyzing and handling failure cases. So similar what you saw on the previous slide, knowing the state of the art and reflecting the metrics and the method design. So if you're interested, feel free to check out the paper. I found it really interesting to gather all of the results. Before I close, I just wanted to share some further interesting observations that we found during our analysis of all of those competitions. We often thought that the ranking in the paper was inconsistent with the ranking on the website for no obvious reason. And if I would be a participant of such a challenge, I would be quite pissed, actually, if I would, for example, be the winner on the website and not in the paper. In two cases where we collected the data from challenges, we did some simple checksums with true positives, true negatives, etc. And we revealed errors in the challenge organizer's metric calculation, of course, very critical. Then we have missing value handling. So sometimes in competitions, the algorithms could just submit their output, and they could decide to not submit all of this. So often the best ranked methods are those that fail on many data sets. And the last one, there was one challenge with 2 participants, and the organizer won, which I also find a bit ridiculous. All right, so with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions.